I hope everyone has had a chance, hello, to get a little something to eat and to have a little fellowship with those around you. This is a really special day for us. We are joined right now by John Edgar Wideman. We are going to be joined soon by the author Timothy Tyson. He is right now making his way to Washington, D.C. from Durham, North Carolina. He had a little logistical issue this morning with travel, and he was undaunted, unable to get on a plane. He got in a car, and he is driving here and will be here momentarily. So he will join us in process as we begin this conversation. This is a real treasure here at Aspen, the Gildenhorn book series. It's a chance for us to talk about books that reveal hard truths in our life, that help us understand difficult things, that help us understand joyous moments, that help us understand an ever-changing world. And this is made possible with the generosity from Alma Gildenhorn. So I would love to have the room thank her for her generosity. And you have food on your lap, so we're not going to ask you to stand. Just raise your hands. Thank you very much for allowing us to have these conversations. They start in this room, but they never stay in this room. People learn things. Things are revealed that often stay with us in the course of this conversation. I think that this will happen today. It is really wonderful that these two books were given birth at the same time, because it is this beautiful collision of life and letters and the limits to our full understanding of a case that happened in 1955 but still resonates in very important ways today. We're talking about the death of Emmett Till.
Yes.
You first encountered this in 1955 as a young man. It was the summer of 1955. You experienced your first love, as you write in the pages of your book. You even share her name. A felicitous
and
name.
I won't share it today.
But you do give some details. And you talk about learning about love and also learning about hatred and how hatred can manifest itself in taking the life of a young man. And you also learned a little bit about the contours of manhood in that summer with someone who moved into your neighborhood, who had a big flashy car and lived at the end of the block. His name was Big Jim. So can you tell us a little bit about your first encounter with the Emmett Till story? You still remember seeing the pages of Jet magazine?
I don't remember any particular scenario. If I wanted to sit down and write it, for instance, I couldn't say it was in my grandmother's house on Tioga Street, and I was in the bedroom, or I was in the living room, or there weren't that many rooms in any of the houses we lived in. But I can't be specific about the location. It was an emotional moment, and so it resonates in terms of feeling rather than the P's and Q's of places and exact time. But that emotional resonance is clearly indelible. It registered with me deeply, and probably is around this morning as we begin this event, and you asked me that question. So it's kind of, if it were a movie and I was trying to make it in terms of what I remember of the scene, it would be sort of dark around me. Well, there wouldn't be much color at all. And it would be quiet, extremely quiet. So, and it seems as if maybe there was no time ever before that moment. It's just, it's of its own. It belongs only to its own time. Now, I don't want to be over dramatic, but you asked, so I'm going to try to tell you that it's a space. I was a young person, and I was alone, and I was in a space that suddenly filled up, suddenly was overflowing to the brim, not with things that I can specify, but with those feelings. I read Jet magazine all the time. I had lots of aunts, my Aunt Geraldine, my Aunt Martha, my Aunt Catherine. They all read Jet and talked about Jet.
Did they call it the Jet?
No, they didn't call it the Jet.
Because that's what in our household it was called, the Jet.
The Jet.
You know what I'm talking about.
The Jet. Well, maybe they did. I might have missed that part. But we usually get in our house, or by the time the magazine got to me, it was usually beaten up and other people had read it. We didn't have a subscription. If you called it the Jet, then you know the whole idea gets passed along. We didn't have subscriptions to things, but they got passed along. They were part of the family. And so I had the magazine. And there I was, and suddenly this space was kind of very odd, very frightening in a sense, this emptiness. Because I had this book in front of me, this magazine, which was quite familiar. And then I turn a page, and there's this kind of unrecognizable face, photo. I didn't know what it was for the longest kind of time. And the closer I looked, the clearer it became that I didn't want to know. The way you might look at roadkill. When you realize something mound or something is roadkill, but you don't want to look too closely because it's scary, particularly for a young person. But there it was, and I recognized enough to see that it was a young man's face. Then I read the caption underneath, and it was a sensation of looking in the mirror. Even though the way you look in the mirror sometimes, if you've combed your hair, but you're not quite sure you've gotten it the way you want to get it, and you're in a hurry, so you just kind of glance at yourself in the mirror, and you see more of a shadow than the actual face. Well, that's what I saw. But it was definitely me. And it was a me that was inconceivable, because it was a me who was dead. I was a 14-year-old kid, and it's the farthest thing in a sense. I guess now I'm betraying my age, because I can say being 14 years old and dead were like two absolutely different kinds of notions. Now, I guess maybe you can't say that. But then they were opposing notions. I was alive, I was very much alive. I was going to live forever. And now here's my face in an image, and I'm dead. And not only am I dead, I'm unrecognizably mutilated. So, what to do with that?
Now, we should say there are young people in the audience, and they may not fully know the Emmett Till story and what happened. Emmett Till was murdered in Money, Mississippi. His body was found slightly outside of Money. He was headed for a swift burial, but his mother, Mamie Till, who was in Chicago, insisted that the body be transferred to Chicago. And despite the fact that it had been badly mutilated, she decided that she wanted the world to see what she saw when she opened up that casket.
I want the world to see what they've done to my baby.
Yes, that's exactly what she said. And so his body was held almost in state. It was in an open casket that was covered with glass, and thousands of people, it's estimated that as many as 50,000, some say many more, visited a church on the south side of Chicago to see his body. And it was photographed by two different photographers for Ebony and the Jet. One was a close-up and one was a full-body image, and that's what you encountered as a young man. So that was how you encountered the story of Emmett Till. You have been writing about the sort of circular nature of fathers and sons, and that is true also in this book. You encountered the story of Emmett Till as a young person where you saw yourself because you were the same age, but you encountered the story of Lewis Till, and that's really what you write about in this book, Writing to Save a Life. You write about Lewis Till. Can you talk to us about how you encountered his story and how much you actually knew of his story? Because many people don't know the story of Lewis Till and what happened to him while he was serving in World War II in Europe.
I had not heard much about Lewis Till. I mean, I was a man, I was a person, so I had a father, so I figured Emmett had to have a father. But what happened with Till, and one reason I wrote the book that I did, is that our historical imagination, our collective imagination, orphans young black people, particularly young black men, orphans us in the sense that in the collective imagination, our fathers don't exist. They just don't exist. And there are lots of stories and myths and arguments and theories about the missing black father. But it's kind of a consensus that they don't count. They're just not around. They don't matter. Now, obviously, that's not so. That's not true. But if in a story like Emmett Till's, that is so well known, commemorated in the National Museum of African American History with his coffin on display, and if you ask people of my generation anyway, you heard of Emmett Till, all the hands go up. Then you heard of Lewis Till? Huh? What? So that disconnect between the generations of black men is as old as the country is old. It was systematic, institutionalized. When young black children were taken away from their families, and even a step before that, when families were destroyed in Africa and let off in chains to come to the New World. There was a violent separation and skewing of the family structure and of the possibility of family structure. Now, it's nice to have a father and nice to have somebody to pat you on the back, and Ozzie and Harriet and a good old American family and Dagwood and Blondie and da-da. All that's fun and nice and useful. But it works at a much deeper level as well. When one asks, who am I? Where do I come from? What am I? What am I worth? Part of the ability to answer that question is to say, I'm not an orphan. I'm not alone. And even if I am an orphan, even if I am alone, to be able to show the connections that in fact exist. Anyway, we don't have that. We have not had that privilege as young African American people. That privilege has been, there's been an intervention. So I think it's been incumbent on me and others, and certainly it's something I worked hard at, to reestablish that historical continuity, that living, not only biological, but ideological and aesthetic connection. Because who do I look like? What are my features? What are my features? The features on my face, are they just not like this Hispanic kid next to me, just not like this Jewish kid next to me, or am I something always not like something else? Therefore strange. Therefore maybe even suspect. The features on my face are there for a very good reason. There have been people working on these features and displaying these features and exchanging these features, and biologically things have happened. My hair, my eyes, the way my body moves, et cetera, et cetera. All this doesn't come from TV.
Emmett Till looked quite a bit like his father. Not always. When he was born, apparently, he had very fair skin and for a time had very light eyes, and much was made of that in his community. And then as he got older, he started to look very much like his father. But his father was absent in his life. Mamie Till and Emmett Till couldn't make a marriage of it. And Mamie Till went on and married someone else, and Emmett Till was surrounded by love and lots of men in his life, but Lewis Till was not there. Who was Lewis Till, and what happened to him first of all, why did he wind up in the Army, and then what happened to him when he went there?
Well, that was a question you asked me before. I just didn't answer it. I was in my own
That's
way.
why I have to,
That was in my
sometimes you
own
knock on the
way,
front door, and then you have to go around to the side
creeping
door.
up on it. It's like my writing, you pick up the book, you think it's one thing, you start reading, it's another thing. Maybe it's nothing, but it's going to do things its way. And the whole fun of reading people's books is they don't do them. They don't think, and they don't have the same ideas you do. So that's the fun. At least that's the fun for me. Anyway, I came in contact with Lewis Till in a couple of different ways. First of all, the roundabout way I was talking. He's fathers and sons in that generic sense. By the time I found anything out about Lewis Till, I was already a grown man. I'd already taught in university a long time. I'd probably talked about Emmett Till in my African American studies classes, but Lewis Till just had not come up. I was reading a book about African American soldiers in World War II, written by a woman named Alice Kaplan. A book called The Interpreter. And in that book, she was attempting to tell the story, basically, of America's injustice to its black servicemen. She was following a particular young man, a young soldier, who had been executed by the military. And that led her into thinking about more executions. And actually, her book was about a Frenchman, a French guy who was an interpreter. And he was a novelist, and Alice Kaplan was interested in this writer. And following his trail, she got into his business, his job as an interpreter for the Army at trials of soldiers who were being tried for capital crimes. And a lot of these soldiers happened to be black Americans, and so Alice Kaplan learned about this injustice through her research. She wrote about going to visit a cemetery in France where there are 80-odd bodies of American soldiers who were executed in war, all the theaters of the war, Pacific, European. And as I said, there are 80-some bodies there, and about 90%, 85, 90% of the bodies are bodies of African Americans. So already there's something quite strange. And as she investigated the particular soldier she was interested in for her book called The Interpreter, she passed by a grave that belonged to Lewis Till. And I read her story of visiting that cemetery. And it was very important to me at the time when I read it, because I knew nothing about that cemetery. I'd never heard a word about it. And I had not thought specifically a lot about Lewis Till. So that opened a door. And boom, I began to think, well, I better find out something about this man. Actually, my first reaction was, when I read Alice Kaplan this, I got to get my behind to that place in France. How in the world could a place like this exist? And I'm a scholar, a writer, an intellectual, and I don't know about it. I don't know about it given all the implications. I didn't know, and or at least I had not thought a lot about African American soldiers in World War II. At least that's what I believed when I first read Kaplan. Then I realized I knew a lot more than I was willing to admit, much more than I had registered and in fact thought about and took responsibility for, because that's the real point. Both as a writer and as a human being and as a citizen, when you begin to look around you and you don't just notice the little bits and pieces, the facts, the information. But you decide some things you must change, some things you must commit yourself to, some things are intolerable. So finding out that black soldiers had that kind of unfair treatment in World War II was something I had to follow through.
And it got inside you and you couldn't let go of it.
And then it became quite clear to me also, in a weird way, that I had not found Lewis Till. Lewis Till had found me. And some of the same reverberations occurred between my thought of him and my exposure to the photograph of his son. How did I not know Emmett Till's father had been executed by the military? I just could not take responsibility for that ignorance, for not having that knowledge.
And he was executed. He was charged with rape and murder.
Yes, in Italy. He was charged with one murder and a couple of rapes, all on the same night, in a place called Civitavecchia, Italy. The war was over. Americans were encamped in that area. There was a camp for Italian prisoners of war up a hill. The area itself was called Civitavecchia, and there was a watering place, a well down at the bottom of a hill. Up on the hill was the camp where the prisoners of war from Italian prisoners of war were stationed, and the American camp was over here, and then just people, lots of people, displaced people, immigrants, because the war was still going on, and Italy was torn up, and people were, like in Syria, just wandering around looking for a place. And the rapes and the murder occurred in that area. The area was also notoriously a place where American soldiers bought liquor and women, a kind of a red light, an unofficial red light district that served the military.
His case was not an entire mystery because it was, people knew about the case of Lewis Till, and for a time it surfaced at a key moment in the adjudication of the Emmett Till case.
Yes.
When Mamie Till, when Roy Bryant and when Bryant and Milam were acquitted, Mamie Till continued to search for justice in the murder of her son and was seeking a civil trial. And at that moment, at a key moment, the Lewis Till file found its way to someone else's hands, and it surfaced at a key moment, and that daisy chain of sexual misconduct involving a father and involving a son was just too much for people to stomach at that time, and the civil case wound up being abandoned.
There are all sorts of lessons about power and rules and law embedded in the Lewis Till story. Lessons which are rather discouraging, to say the least. Starting with a cemetery that was declared, in a sense, unhallowed ground. This cemetery where the 80-odd people who had been executed by the military were buried was segregated. It was segregated, given its contents, literally, but it was also segregated from a huge cemetery across the way, a World War I cemetery, where there are thousands of bodies, heroes, and very fancy marble headstones, and the whole thing is terraced and organized, and things grow there, and there are marble monuments, and it's the sort of place where if you had lost, if you had sacrificed someone in your family in a war, you wouldn't be happy to see it, but you would see respect. You would see the country's gratitude for for the sacrifice of your family member. Plot E was separate. The plot where these men were buried, where Lewis Till was buried. It's kind of hidden in a grove of trees. When I went there, I had a hard time finding it. Nobody was around, but I eventually did find it and looked at it. But what I'm talking about in terms of the way it's connected to law and law enforcement and rules and justice, all those questions became more and more urgent and more necessary to investigate as I found out more and more about Lewis Till. Well, small things. Start with small things. Why did a cemetery like that exist? What did it represent? What did the idea of it represent? What kind of world or society was my country, is America, that it's not enough to execute men, that you take their remains and put them in the ground like they're some sort of devils, or that somehow they could still infiltrate the goodness of our society if they were buried beside their comrades in a shared cemetery or resting place. Who decided that kind of memorial should exist? Or not really memorial, it's like a hiding place. It's like the hundreds of probably low patches of ground where slaves were buried in the South during the period of slavery. And it's probably like a number of places where the remains of people who were lynched or who died violently in the South in racial conflict are.
But this happened, this is part of the military.
But what happened to Lewis Till happened always under the aegis of government, rules, law. He was an American soldier.
And the court-martial process is
The court-martial process
protracted.
itself supposedly protects individual rights. You're supposedly innocent until proven guilty. But if you look closely and study closely, as I have, Lewis Till's story, then you see none of those protections, in fact, existed.
You examine the file.
Yes. I wrote, jumping around now, but as I got more interested, I wrote to the archives in Virginia and received a copy of the Lewis Till file. And it was fascinating. I had to wait a long time for it, and I didn't know what I was going to get. I'm not a historian. This was all something I was doing because I just felt compelled to do it. But this one day, a bunch of papers arrived. There must be 300 sheets of paper. And what it was is a kind of mishmash of everything from letters from the commanding general to his underlings, orders that one officer should turn up for the court-martial, a full transcript of the trial of Lewis Till, his death certificate, letters that were sent to Mamie Till notifying her of his death, but not informing her
Of the circumstances.
of the fact that he was executed, so that when the trial of her son's killers was occurring in Mississippi, at that point, 10 years after the death of her husband, she still didn't know what the hell exactly had happened to her husband. So she's sitting there hoping for justice again in a courtroom, an official courtroom. She's hoping for justice. And a newspaper story breaks that the father of the young man, Emmett, who was murdered, turns out not to be an American hero, not an American soldier who died defending his country. But this dude was hanged by the U.S. military for rape and murder in Italy 10 years previously. And so you can imagine the head shaking and bad seed. Seed never falls far from the tree. And so the kind of informal logic to explain the lynching, the murder of Emmett Till, became almost a form of self-congratulations.
Explain what you mean by that, self-congratulation.
Well, if I'm Milam, I'm pretending I'm one of the killers. If I'm Milam or his brother-in-law, I could look at my friends and say, see what that nigger's father did? They oughtn't have us in here for a trial, man. They ought to be thanking us. We ought to have a medal. Because this little dude, this little bugger, if he had grown up, he might have killed one of our women. He might have raped a couple. Look, he barely out of a diaper and he's molesting this woman in a store. So we're not murderers, we're kind of good guys. And that kind of mentality, which I certainly wouldn't attribute to everybody in Mississippi at that time, or everybody in America now or then, but there was enough of it to create a groundswell of support for the murderers. And when the trial was over, they lit cigars like they just won the Final Four and accepted congratulations, and never were punished for the crime which they clearly committed. In fact, and here's where the legal
A crime for which
ramifications.
a crime that they actually confessed to.
They
William Bradford
confessed.
Huey.
They confessed to a reporter from who was writing for Look magazine. He published the story.
And paid them for their confession,
They were paid like $3,000. That was their.
which is a lot of money in 1955. That is.
Yeah, and they admitted what they did. They described it. They were there, and the reason they got away with it, with this admission, is because they had already been tried and found innocent, so they couldn't be tried again
Under double
for the
jeopardy.
same crime. Justice, law.
Now this is the point where it is really, I don't want Tim Tyson to get any tickets, but I wish he would come rushing in the room right now, because you're working on your book, and Tim Tyson is working on another book which reveals new information about the Emmett Till case. He interviews Carolyn Bryant, who is now in her 80s. She has written a memoir which is under lock and key at a secret institution.
Archive in
in
Mississippi. Yes.
And she's written a book called More Than a Wolf Whistle, but he's had a chance to interview her. A relative of hers has reached out to him because she loved a book that he wrote, Blood Done Signed My Name. And he sits down and talks to her, and in the course of the conversation, he learns, and now we all know because of the book that he's written, that Carolyn Bryant Dunham, has not told the full story in her court testimony. The court testimony was that there was more than a wolf whistle, that Emmett Till had grabbed her by the hand, had attempted to put an arm around her waist, had been very sexually aggressive with her. She now says that that is not true. She told a lie. When you first learned of this, what was your reaction? I wonder if you knew about that story as you were working on this story.
No, my book was finished and going through the press by the time I read Tim Tyson's book. His book was fascinating to me, but I must admit that I didn't believe the myth of what had happened inside that little store in Money, Mississippi, no more than I believed that there was justice in the courtroom in Money, Mississippi. There was not. It was not very difficult for me to learn, or it wasn't hard for me to accept that this lady, Carolyn Bryant, had embellished on the facts and told whatever story made her look good, or whatever story her peers wanted to hear. Her own cousin, a very good friend who was in the store, or sister-in-law who was in the store with her, in the back room when Emmett Till was in the front room with Carolyn Bryant. Her friend said, her relative, in-law said, Carolyn didn't like to be in the store alone at night. And when the men went off to do their work, they always left us in the store, and we had to stay there and keep it open and work. And you were tired from dealing with the kids all day. And Carolyn just didn't like it. She wasn't used to that kind of thing, working all night. She's a little slightly higher social class in the family, the Milam family she married into. So she didn't like being stuck in the store.
And the Milam Bryant family ran a series of stores all throughout Mississippi.
So, according to her sister-in-law, the story was made up about Till, or the story was made much worse, in order to shame and embarrass the husband so he wouldn't leave them in the store anymore at night to work. So, it's very human on all sides. But actually going into a court, lying in front of a jury about something that a defendant did and knowing that it could be a capital crime, that's a fib of a whole
Fib
nother,
is an interesting word.
whole nother level. So I wasn't surprised, and I didn't even really pay that much attention to this, in quotes, new fact. I've talked to Tim about this. I thought that the whole business of making Carolyn Bryant's confession like it was news, like boom, breaking news, as Lester says every night. We have breaking news for you tonight. It wasn't that breaking news. It was a good way to sell books, and I wish somebody had put the tag on my book. It probably would have sold more. But and it's not to derogate Tim's book at all, but that was a good way to sell it as a kind of expose, the real truth of the Till murder. But we didn't learn enough from her. We didn't learn very much, and neither did Mr. Tim Tyson.
She still holds many stories close to her that she is yet to reveal.
She said, she admitted to him that the story she told to the jury and to the foreman of the jury was exaggerated.
And was different, we should say, and was different than the story that she first told to investigators when she was first questioned.
Yes.
And just to help you understand how the tic-tac of the story, they were at first going to, they thought about arresting her also because she had identified Emmett Till when they pulled him out of bed and brought him to the car. There was someone in the car, and it was thought to be Carolyn Bryant, who said, yes, that's him.
Then the original investigation of the Till murder, Carolyn Bryant was under suspicion because the car that came to the house where Emmett Till was sleeping with his cousins and his uncle, great uncle, the car that came to that house had 3 people in it, and there was a woman, according to witnesses. And that woman is the one who pointed out Till when they took Till out to the car. So clearly that woman was implicated in the murder. She was an accessory. And there was a warrant out for her arrest.
Which they dropped, though.
And it was hidden at the warrant. They just, again, the law. There was a warrant written on with this hand, but with the other hand, don't bother them. And she was allowed to hide in plain sight, and nobody bugged her. So that's one time that's one story about her. And then when she and she was scared. She's a young woman. They're all very young people.
And she has 2 young children. She
has 2 young kids. Her husband's in danger. I mean, if he disappears, who's going to take care of the family? She may be implicated and go to jail. So she's panicked. She has to be scared. You'd be, I'd be. And so she's doing whatever she needs to do to protect herself. And what was needed is a good old juicy, nasty story about being violently accosted. And she provided that to the deputies, to the sheriff's deputies. And then in the courtroom outside of the, not in front of the jurors, not in front of the open court, but to a sidebar, she told the story that Till had grabbed her wrist and grabbed her around the waist and all that. And that's the story she told Tim Tyson was not true.
There is an African proverb that holds that the body that you attempt to bury in the yard yesterday has a toe sticking out of the ground today. And it is apt in the story of Emmett Till for many reasons. When they discovered his body in the river, there were literally toes sticking out of the water that someone found, and they would determine that those toes probably belonged to a person of color, and that person of color was probably Emmett Till, and indeed it was. But that proverb is apt also because of what it means to the story of Lewis Till and the examination of what happened to all those soldiers, and whether the military should revisit the court-martial system that led to 85 to 90% of the soldiers buried in that particular Plot E being men of color. And it pertains to Carolyn Bryant and what happens to a woman who's now in her 80s, and what should happen with the Emmett Till case, and the question of whether that case should be reopened, should be re-adjudicated. There are questions of whether the Department of Justice, whether the Attorneys General in Mississippi should revisit this case. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts that the toes never stop popping up. One benefit of writing is that if you publish a book and it's sort of disseminated in all sorts of places and people you don't know, would never meet, read it and think about it. I get letters. I get people who come to events like this. And there have been some fascinating intersections.
Such as?
I got a copy of a letter from a man's grandfather who lived in South Carolina. His name was Pickerel. And he had been in the Army in World War II, and he had been a prison guard, an Army prison guard. He was the guard in the prison where Lewis Till was held. And so I read this man's letter in which he described Lewis Till. And he said Lewis Till was a kind of a hero among the guards because there was a fight in the yard of the prison where this man, Mr. Pickerel, was working. I think he was an officer. And there was a fight, and the guards got in trouble, and Lewis Till rescued the guard. So the guards liked him, favored him, would take him out on the town sometimes to a movie when they went to a movie. Here's Lewis Till, this bad dude in history, and he was a kind of a pet of the guards and had special treatment until the death sentence came down and he was moved into solitary confinement, just to be next to Ezra Pound, one of the most famous poets in America. These are the kind of reverberations that just never stop. These are the toes that start to poke up. I was at a reading, and a man came up to me with 3 of my books and said, "Could you sign these for me?" And he gave me a piece of paper with names on it. And it turns out that those books were intended as gifts for his old buddies, young men he had grown up with, who are old men now, or middle-aged men. And he wanted me to sign those books so he could present them to them. Who were these kids? These kids were the son of Gerald Smith, who was the defense attorney for Lewis Till in that who was a defense attorney in the Till trial. Now, think about it. Here we are about social context. And so I signed these books to send to this judge's son. The judge himself, who was well-known in his area and a reputable juror, he had a breakdown after the trial. He's not the judge, he was a defense attorney. He was a prosecutor. He was prosecuting the two white guys who allegedly killed Milam and Bryant, who killed Emmett Till. So he was in this impossible position. The community didn't want anything to happen to the murderers, the perpetrators. So if he did his job too well and got them in trouble, he would be ostracized. He would be condemned. If he didn't do his job well, all the newspapers and people, the outsiders who watched the trial, would be on his case about that. And it didn't, for him, it caused him to break down. A couple of years later, he got to be more and more of an alcoholic, and he committed suicide. So that's in 1950s. And then here I sit in a room maybe 9 months ago, and I'm signing books for that man's son. And you're asking me, and it's like you say toes sticking up in the water. Another metaphor is you, in a very still pool, you throw a coin, and the ripples start in a way they never end. They never end. In a way they probably continue into the earth. You can't see them then, but one butterfly's wing shakes the whole cosmos, all that stuff. But anyway, I was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. And I had lots of buddies. One of my buddies was one of my buddies ran for president a couple years ago. Another buddy was governor of Oklahoma. One friend was named, well, I won't name him any more than I'll name my old lover, but I had a buddy at Oxford who was in the military. And I got along with him real well at that time because the military had PX privileges. And they could get cheap booze and big fat American steaks in England. None of the rest of us could. So it was nice to hang out occasionally with our well-endowed military friends. I mean, aside from the fact that we're nice guys. Anyway, we're talking about connections. So this man was a colonel, retired now, in the United States Air Force, happens to sit on the Commission of Monuments and Cemeteries, U.S. Government Commission. And he read, we had been in touch vaguely once or twice, but one of his students was a student of mine. Excuse me, no. One of his students was also a Rhodes Scholar, a Black Rhodes Scholar. And I've been recently in touch with this man about Alain Locke. But forgive the old man, I'm going to get to the point of the story. The point of the story is my Oxford colonel, Air Force, retired, sits on a commission that oversees cemeteries. It has a legal and sort of political responsibility to make sure they're well tended, organized, et cetera. And he read the story about Emmett Till and my story about Louis Till. And now that commission is looking at this cemetery, Plot E, in France, and asking questions about it, and asking who's there, and should we look at the way that those men got there? Isn't it something that the government needs to make a
So you put a rock and the ripples headed in his direction.
Yes.
Let's let the ripples move in this room and let's take a few questions. I'm going to ask, Janet, do you mind setting us off with questions? We have in the audience Janet Langhart Cohen, who's here with former Senator Bill Cohen. And Janet has written a wonderful play that I hope some of you have seen, which is about imagining what would happen if Anne Frank and Emmett Till met and had a conversation and forced us to look at some of the moral questions. And as a journalist and as someone who brings elegance into the world all the time, I'm wondering if you would start us out with a question for John Edgar Wideman.
Oh, thank you. I am surprised at this. I want to thank Alma Gildenhorn for making all of this possible, and you, Michele, for your wonderful interview with John. John, it's wonderful to see you again. I did write a play. It's an imaginary conversation between Anne Frank and Emmett Till. Emmett Till is the son of Lewis Till that John has been speaking about. And John, you and I are the same age as Emmett Till. And when you tell that story of what it was like when you first heard of his murder and saw his face, I was cringing, because when I discovered that picture in the magazine in 1955, it was a summer before we went to school. Labor Day, we'd have our Labor Day, and then our parents would buy us new clothes for the school year. And we're all excited. And the irony is, I had just closed the diary of Anne Frank. And even though we knew how her story ended, I cried, but I had hope. And when I closed her diary, I opened the pages of Jet magazine, and there was Emmett. And I didn't realize until someone asked me a question about my book, talking about growing up in apartheid America, having a cousin who was lynched in a very different way than Emmett was, in a very different way than Mr. Till, his father, Lewis, was. I felt a sort of two-ness. I felt I could identify with Anne and identify with Emmett, two teens who lived in societies that didn't protect them. But Emmett Till was especially moving because he was here in my country, in my time, my race. And I watched that summer, our elders, our mothers and fathers that you talked about, John, they were hurt, scared, and helpless because our society could murder all of us, any of us, with impunity. And Michele, you're talking about the toes that keep sticking up. They stick up with Trayvon. They stick up with Michael Brown. They stick up with Eric Garner. They stick up with Amadou Diallo. They stick up with Grant, Walter Scott, and they could stick up with any one of us. So, John, I want to thank you for writing the book. I interviewed you a long, long time ago with Julian Bond. You were wonderful then, and you're wonderful now. And I'd like you, if you would, to say something about the book you wrote about your brother. You lost someone in a different way. Thank you, Michele, for asking me to talk. I didn't mean to talk that long, but thank you.
She asked you about your brother, but I also want, and because there are young people in the room, if you might also address the toes that she was talking about today, the daisy chain of names that we have seen, and the effect of seeing, there are young people in this room who have seen Black Death on small screens on a regular basis. This is a new feature of life in America. And much like the picture of Emmett Till in the Jet magazine, the difference was that you saw that. Young black men had been killed in questionable circumstances all throughout the South, but they were usually buried hastily and people didn't know about it. But Mamie Till wanted to make sure that people saw that. What happens now is we see those pictures because they are delivered to us in the devices that we've heard occasionally going off in the room. We see them, and I wonder what the effect of that is, and if there's a connection, if that is, as she says, the toes still popping out, a connection, a through line from Emmett Till to 2017.
One reason I wrote my book and wrote it the way I did is because in my mind, the big problem is whether you're talking about Trayvon Marshall, whether you're talking about Emmett Till. When it comes to African American young men and women, they are seen in a vacuum. They are seen and designated as victims, and maybe sad victims, and isn't it too bad, but they're seen in isolation. There's always a family. There's always a family. There's always a connection. And this is what is damning to our country and to the way we imagine ourselves. The fact that we continue to choke off one generation from the next. We continue to blind one generation to the next. And that's the real meaning of bringing together Lewis Till and Emmett Till. He was not an orphan. Even if he had a different name, if it was the man's sperm in that woman, there was a father and there is a mother, and there always are fathers and mothers. And it's much easier to forget about a victim when you are not responsible for answering to that larger family. And you wrote about Anne Frank. Well, that's that moron who's the press secretary of the president. He put his big foot or small foot in his mouth yesterday. And you all know what I'm talking about. You know, nobody used gas to kill people in World War, even those terrible people like Hitler. Well, suddenly the Holocaust is relevant. We see it in 1,000 tweets. It's on the nightly news. We're reminded that, like Anne Frank, there's a family. And that family includes the story of the Holocaust. And they're not going to let you forget it. They're not going to let you forget it. You're not going to be able to make some offhand comment about a victim without invoking the entire history of victimhood and how it happens and how we've been complicit, how our institutions have been complicit in them. And that's the point I want to make with Lewis Till and Emmett Till. They are part of my family. I am part of their family. And if we're thinking halfway straight, they're Americans. So they're part of everybody, most of the people in this room's family. And if you're Ethiopian or Eskimo or French, they're part of the human family. And that is as significant a fact. And so, yes, the ripples go out, the toes are up, but why is it so easy? Why is it an ironclad tradition in this country, in our history, historiography, that we are able to separate the victim from the victim's family, the immediate blood family and the larger family and the ethical family?
Let's make sure the ripples go in this direction, and make sure we take at least one question from this side of the room, if there is one. Anyone on this side of the room? Yes, right over. Yep.
Hello, how are you? Thank you for your book. And I know you weren't the one that interviewed Carolyn Bryant, but do you believe that there's a duty, and I know Michele touched on it briefly, but is there a duty to the Justice Department to reopen this case as though she was an accessory and probably one of the biggest reasons why this young man was murdered? And as you mentioned, it's so easy to forget the family. And with the Holocaust, and when that's brought up, everybody's enraged and wants everyone to know about it. But when, excuse me, it comes to Black life, it's easily forgotten and justice rarely received. Do you think this would be the turning point if the Justice Department actually went back to seek justice for him?
So 2 questions there. Does the Justice Department have a responsibility to reopen this case and look at the question of whether Carolyn Bryant was an accessory? And if they did reopen the case, what would be the impact on that?
Well, there are two questions, and I think there are 2 answers. They deserve 2 answers. The historical contingent fact that particular case get light and be re-investigated, reopened, that would be great. But that's one case, and that would defeat my point. The more important second question you asked is how does that become important? How does that get beyond the single case? Because they've got a hell of a lot of trials. we'd be spending an awful lot of time and energy, again, dispersing our energy, using it up, and that's not to say each case doesn't deserve it. But what's important is that you, the speaker, decide in your own way that you're not going to let it slide, that you are part of the Till family, that is something you're not going to let your neighbors forget, that you're not going to let your children forget, that you are not going to forget. And how do you make that kinship accessible to others? How do you project the importance to others? That's the question I deal with. That's the question I'm trying to deal with in my books. Everybody doesn't have to write books. But we all know when we're being honest with ourselves about something, when we're just mouthing off, and when we engage ourselves with a fact or a person or an idea, and we just ain't gonna let it go. So yes, as a center of a movement, anything will do. But it's the movement, the larger collective sense that must.
Alma?
Okay. Your interest in the life and death of Louis Till is very interesting, and it's very compelling. What you don't tell us is, were the charges against Louis Till, were they valid charges? Has anyone ever looked into the truth of what he was executed for? The people that did this horrible thing to Emmett Till did not know until the trial proceeded. They just did something terribly vicious to Emmett. How do you make the connection between the two, if indeed the first trial was, I don't want to use the word appropriate, was the punishment at that time for the military?
Well, I don't have to make the case. The state of Mississippi made the case that they should not, Milam and Bryan, the two killers, didn't deserve to be prosecuted because they probably did us all a favor.
But what about the Louis Till case?
The Louis Till case, now that's a different question. The question was the factual information behind that. That case, should that case be reopened? Should it be? That's something I take up
in the Louis Till file. If I think you're asking, in the Louis Till file, having had a chance to look at it, were the charges valid?
I don't believe so. That's part of my book. I make an argument very systematically, look at the case against Till, and give a counter explanation. I think essentially, we can't go into the particulars right now, but I think essentially the crime that Till and the other man, Fred McMurray, committed was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, because there was only circumstantial evidence used to convict them. They were in a courtroom in front of witnesses who had been there on that night in Civitavecchia, Italy, who had seen the perpetrators, and nobody could finger Till or his buddy. They were fingered as black men. That was enough. Now, did Till do it? I wouldn't know. And I would not claim that I did. But I'd say that the case for the government was not conclusive.
Could they have made the same case in a criminal court as opposed to a court-martial? Based on the circumstantial evidence. This is in the book, but it's a question that I had, is that would that chain of evidence have held up in a criminal court as opposed to a military
Depends
court?
on where and when the court
Okay.
sat. And that's the problem. You've identified the problem complete. There is no one law. There is no such thing as law with a big L in this country. If somebody thinks that, they better think again.
Isn't that a statement? There is no one, because, there should be.
We think, we pretend there is. We pretend there is.
Ethelbert.
Near the end of your book, as we get past Emmett and Lewis Till, I felt that you gave, like a jazz riff, a very strong statement about black fatherhood. You talk about black fatherhood near the end of the book, and it's very, very personal. And I felt it was almost like a standalone part of the book. I wish you could comment about that.
Part of my anger, part of my outrage at the historical events that led to Lewis Till's execution and his son's murder and the freeing of the son's killers. Part of that reflects events that have occurred, events that are unjust, that I believe were motivated by prejudice, were motivated by racial myth. Those kinds of things have scarred my life very deeply. And so I think when I'm writing about the Tills, I have that kind of motivation, or that, and it's not a hidden agenda. I'm trying to sort out what's happened to me, what happened to my son, what happened to my brother, what happened to my uncle, what happened to maybe you, your friends, et cetera, et cetera. It's all connected, Again, it's the total fabric that I'm trying to put on trial. The total fabric that allows what happened, the death of both Tills, even though the deaths, one was a lynching and the other was in a courtroom. I'm saying there's not a lot of difference if you look at the mechanics.
Can you read? And this might be a nice way to close us out. Can you begin there and read to there?
I think. By the way, thank you all for turning up, and thank you for being the stimulus for my thinking and reining me in and bringing me back to talking to issues, because I finish a book, it's all over the place. I'm all over the place, and
But I love that you shared stories with us, because when you write a book, it's not the end, it's the beginning of another part of the journey, because you put a basket on the table and people continue to put things in it, and the things that you have shared with us about the prosecutor's son, about the prison guard, are so interesting that it makes me hope that you will write an epilogue.
well, I'm writing a book of stories, and one of the heroes in one of the stories is Nat Turner. So
Can we have him back for that?
And another one about John Brown. They're my American heroes. But I'll read. I can't rescue dead Lewis Till from prison and the hangman. The Till file's my hobby horse. Me astride it like some kind of chocolate Don Quixote. I can't save Till, not father, not son. Too late for the Tills. Lewis Till's case is colder than Rakim's, my brother's. Why not work for live prisoners? My wife has asked me. Millions of people are locked up at this very moment. I am. I do, I want to say. Want to explain to her, to myself. I work for an incarcerated son and brother. They are locked inside me. I am imprisoned with them during every moment that I struggle with the Till file. No choice, trying to find words to help them, to help myself. Help carry the weight of hard years spent behind bars. If I return to Till's grave, I will confess to him first thing that the Lewis Till Project is about saving a son and brother, about saving myself.
I have always believed that history finds the right conservator. And I think this history certainly found the right conservator in you. Thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you so much for sharing your story. You're going to sign books out front. I know there are other questions. A young man has a question right here. Bill has a question. I want to make sure that we hear from at least one of the students. So if you could ask your question, and we'll then move on to the book signing.
Does it lead up to his trial?
Hold on just a second. We want to make sure we can hear you.
Does your book, does it lead up to the trial of his, like his execution? Like, it shows that, like, he's in, like, prison, then it leads up to, like, his memories and then his trial.
So does the book walk you through the trial and the actual execution?
The execution appears, but I wasn't there. So I tried to imagine it. You know, just by coincidence, another one of these connections. Some man who's a military historian, sent me, or he put in a book, a number of photos, which he says are photos from the actual Till execution. And one of them shows Lewis Till standing on a scaffold. Another one shows him being somebody, supposedly Till, marched through a field behind a whole bunch of soldiers. Now, I don't go there inside the book directly, but the character, my character, who's writing the book, thinks about those things. So in that sense, they appear.
And we
In
have
that sense.
the former Secretary of Defense in the House who can talk a little bit about military history.
Alma, thank you very much. Alma, thank you for sponsoring of this program, Michele, for your moderating it, hosting it, and John, for your writing of the book. I want to put something in the basket. Number one, you don't have to go to Emmett Till's grave. Janet arranged to have Emmett Till's tree planted on Capitol Hill in a big ceremony a year and a half ago. And so that tree is now flourishing up there as a symbol of what's taken place in the past, but what hopefully will take place in the future in terms of its growth. But secondly, we've seen so many cases in America where black men have been tried and convicted based on false evidence, on evidence withheld, DNA samples gone awry, et cetera. Go back, if you really want to go back to that grave in France, and look at all of those people who were all the black men who were executed. Look at the Army manual that was put out during World War II that said to all of the military commanders, here's how you treat Negroes. They're hapless, they're surly, they have no patriotism, they can be easily intimidated, et cetera, et cetera. And that was put out, and that was the attitude of the military at the time. So it became very easy for anyone to accuse a black person of having committed a crime, and they're the ones that they executed. A woman could say, he whistled at me, or he grabbed my waist, or he had an affair. No, it was rape, and they string them up. And so you want to go back, look at all of those 80 cases, not only Lewis Till, the other 79 who were there have a story to tell based on what you've said and what you've written. So.
And it's interesting, the military eventually, by the end of World War II, when they decided to segregate the armed forces, issued a different manual that basically said the mistreatment or the subjugation of black men was material aid to the enemy. And they had to go back and re-educate all the people in high positions within the military to explain, you know what we said earlier, that's not necessarily true.
Anyway. But there's hope. Because the military is also an institution which, since it's about life and death and survival, it can't afford some of the bullshit that some of the other institutions that make up the country afford.
That's another scientific term there.
Yes, but the military was a leader, in quotes, in integration and in opening opportunities, and it still does. So there's the best and worst. can be observed in the same institution. And what's important, young folk, is to understand that and know that. And don't just give a pass. Don't just bow down to the notion of the United States Army or the government or the president, but the checkered past that they all bring to bear and how it's going to affect your lives, how it's affect your family's life. That's the way we have to address our country.
To Bill's point, though, the military is now perhaps the most reliable engine of equal opportunity and upward mobility, and perhaps if they can look honestly at its history of race, that it might lead the way for other institutions to look with clear eyes at a history that...
We interviewed Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. When he went to West Point, he was treated with total silence the entire 4 years. No one would talk to him unless it was in an official capacity, giving him a directive. That's how they treated him then. I was president, Janet was president, when President Bill Clinton gave him his 4th star as the great tribute to a great officer.
Thank you. Thank you. We have other questions, but he's going to sign books out front just because of the clock. We're going to have
You
to
come
move
up,
on.
dear. I'll
So
answer your
make sure that
question.
we'll move you right to the front to make sure you get your question asked. Thank you all very, very much. Delicious conversation. John, thank you so much. And we're sorry that Tim didn't get with us, but his book is for sale out front.